Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Bit of a darker topic. Let's do it. What's something that will forever traumatize you? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I was 14 years old when I saw my 3-year-old baby brother's head crushed under the front tire of a car. I'm now 63 and have decided that I should deal with it rather than denying that it messed me up. When I was 12, I crashed an ATV into a tree, hit an ice patch with my little brother and friend on the back. Right before we hit, my brother called out my name and then I blacked out. We all survived, and I got the worst of the injuries, but I still have flashbacks and hear him calling my name 15 years later. Happens a lot right before I fall asleep or in nightmares. I was about 7, my brother about 4. A family of blackbirds had made a nest at our garage. Dad left the car outside, closed the garage door, left the window open for them to come and go, and even built a booby trap under the window in case any of the neighborhood cats fancied their chances. He would take us in there occasionally and lift us up so we could see the chicks. When they fledged, our miserable effing neighbors set mouse traps for them baited with bread, caught them all one at a time and gave them to their dog to play with and kill, while my brother and I screamed and cried on the other side of the fence, and the parent birds fluttered around calling out in distress. This was in front of their grandchildren. I'm in my 60s now, but thinking about it fills me with so much rage and grief I hardly know what to do with myself. I was in a house fire 3 years ago that killed both of my parents, having to watch my childhood home burn down knowing my mom was in there and there was absolutely nothing I could do really effed with me up. About a year or two after that, I was diagnosed with major depression and PTSD. Well, I never seemed to get away from abuse in sports by coaches and teammates, but this was the worst. I had a coach when I was 13 who would consistently throw clipboards at my head and smack me, etc. The worst day was a game where he grabbed me by the jersey, pushed me up against the wall, and smacked it off the brick wall behind me multiple times. He said some derogatory things that I had to hear from other people on the bench because I blacked out and didn't remember anything until I was in the car after the game. Left that game with a concussion and some bruises, not sure what from though. Threw up multiple times in the hospital from hysterically sobbing combined with the concussion. We tried going to the police, but all the people who were quick to tell me what they heard and saw had retracted their stories when they found out he was the coach again the next year. Nothing came of it. Police couldn't do anything without witnesses coming forward, so he got off scot-free. That was almost 10 years ago. But once in a while I'll get a flash of it in a dream, or most likely just a memory locked away. To top it all off, I saw him a year or two ago, where I was working part-time. He tried to behave like nothing happened, asked me what I'm up to. Still playing sports? I said no. Then asked what he's up to, still abusing 13-year-old boys? And everyone else in the store at the time heard it. He left relatively quick after that. It was nice to have that moment. Around 3 years ago, my sister got a psychotic break. We both left our parents' home pretty early, and at the time, we were living in different cities. I got the news from my aunt and literally took the next flight to see her. Went to the hospital that day, and she didn't recognize me. She was literally talking nonsense. She was there a couple days, and around 2 months in a mental hospital. I visited her once a week, which was the maximum allowed. It was really tough to see my sister acting like that and surrounded by other persons with different mental illnesses. The worst part was that my parents did not show up at any time. Years ago, I had a night shift job in a trauma center. We received a call from EMS just before the shift changed. They were bringing us a patient who had been injured in a car accident and were performing CPR. It turned out to be one of our colleagues who was heading to work. She was revived by EMS, but she passed just a short while after. I'll never forget the serene shock trauma room when she and the EMS vehicle arrived. I'll never forget removing her from the Lucas device, which performs the CPR chest compressions, and feeling how icy her hands were, recognizing her recognizable uniform, work badge, and distinctive nursing shoes. I'm a firefighter, paramedic. A few years ago, we responded to a woman whose husband came home and found her unresponsive. She had taken an industrial zip tie and pulled it shut around her neck. She was fully coded upon our arrival. Acetol, flatline on the monitor. We cut off the zip tie and coded her as best we could. By the time we arrived at the ED, she was awake and talking. Those who work in emergency medicine know how truly rare a fully successful code resuscitation is. We were pretty happy with ourselves. We had literally just brought a 36-year-old woman back from the dead and gave her a second chance at life. Maybe she would find happiness. Maybe she would go on to do great things. Maybe she'll get the help she needs and go on to live every day like it's a gift. Maybe she'll be motivated to help others considering suicide. She was admitted to the hospital, but due to the incredibly shitty mental health resources in our state, she was discharged after 72 hours, which she then got in her car and drove to the elementary school and picked up her 6-year-old son to take him fishing for the afternoon. Except, she walked him out to the woods, put a zip tie around his neck, and then zip tied her own. Their bodies were found a few days later. If we hadn't done our jobs so well, that little boy would still be alive. My partner and I had a direct hand in the murder of an innocent child, and there's no way to get past it. If we hadn't tried so hard to save her, the boy would still be alive. I know I'm a complete stranger, and it's easier said than done, but that's not your fault. I'm sorry, but it's not. Seeing someone get caught in a metal lathe I was operating. After 6 long, agonizing months, he died. I can't operate machinery in a production setting ever again. What was really messed up was how the company handled it. I quit a week later. My 17-year-old lover committed suicide by jumping into oncoming traffic. His body had been crushed, dispersed throughout the street, and repeatedly run over. Every piece was spray painted by the police. It was a highway that I frequently used to travel. I once lost it after driving over it. I followed the long route for 5 years up until the paint started to fade. At 25, I was one of 2 that took care of my mother who was in hospice at our house. She was dying of cancer. At some point, we think the cancer went to her brain because she turned against my dad and I. We both took care of her 24/7. She hated us and told us every day until we had to keep her asleep due to her pain. When she passed, I felt relieved, and I still feel so guilty for that. I was seeing a man. He was the second man I'd had a long-term relationship with. He was always into anal play. As a courtesy to him, I tried it multiple times, never could relax enough, and it simply felt painful. I decided it wasn't for me and told him this. I just didn't like it at all. One day when we were having consensual vaginal sex, I was lying on my stomach with him behind me. He shoved my face into the pillow while I screamed and cried and anal-R'd me. He only did about 4 thrusts while I begged him to stop, and then he let up and I was sobbing. He asked if he could finish vaginally. I shrugged for 2 reasons. 1, I couldn't bring myself to outright agree. I didn't want to have sex with this man after what he did to me, and 2, I knew I could have said no afterward, but I felt like he would just take what he wanted anyway, and it would hurt if he decided to force me. Plus, the faster he finished, the faster he would leave. He finished while I was still crying the whole time. He looked remorseful and sad at me like he knew what he did, but he didn't apologize. He left. Afterward, I was bleeding because he tore my asshole because he didn't use any lube at all. To this day, I can't have sex in that position, and I freak out and have panic attacks if a man's dick accidentally gets anywhere near my asshole. I had been dealing with recurrent ovarian cysts for about 3 years at this point, and had cycled through numerous meds. Despite displaying every other symptom of PCOS, my doctors wouldn't test my hormones because I wasn't obese and thus not heavy enough to be considered for it. Upon starting a new birth control, I found myself unable to hold anything down whatsoever. I tried to force myself to eat light meals just enough to make it through work, but my body wouldn't take it. I bring this up during a follow-up appointment. My gyno looks me in the eyes, smirks, and states that my being unable to eat is for the best, because I needed to lose weight anyways. I'm unsure if he simply thought that I was exaggerating, or if he was just trying to ease my anxieties by pushing me to stay on the prescription a bit longer. What I am sure of is that his reaction led to my developing an unhealthy relationship with food as a whole. It's been 7 years since I purged, but I still struggle to allow myself to eat full meals. When I was 10, I was home from school on a snow day, and a breaking news story interrupted the show I was watching. The picture on the screen was my dad's truck, yellow police tape, a Wawa coffee cup on the ground, and a bunch of evidence markers. My dad was a maintenance man at an apartment complex and was shot while shoveling snow. Thankfully he survived and is fine, but I'll never forget that screen. 17 years ago today, I lost my boyfriend of 5 years, Chris. I woke up very early. I was at college and I was 20. He was 21. I had a bad feeling. It was maybe 5 to 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time where I was and 4 to 5 a.m. Central Standard Time where he was. And I just kept calling him, calling, nothing. Then I called his father because he was home for the weekend visiting his dad. His dad said he would have to call me back. His door was locked and he needed to get a drill. What came in the next phone call, nothing could have prepared me for. And something that 17 years later I still haven't healed from. Another instance was my attorney, father blocking my number when I asked him for help to leave an abusive with my 2 kids. I will never ever not be traumatized when I think of what my former parent did. My younger brother attempted suicide. It was bad enough, but there was added stress of rushing around and trying to put things back together after because he lived in a different state then. And probably the cherry on the cake was when I asked my boyfriend if I could just stay home and have one evening to just, cry, after making sure everything and everyone else was fine for then. He said, "Could have told me earlier, now you just wasted my evening." Experiencing my older sister try and commit suicide, she survived. But it was a random school night and both my parents were at work. Dad was out of town and Mom was working late as an EMT. I was playing video games in my room when my sister called me into the kitchen. When I walked in, she was sitting on the floor with a small purse behind her. She asked me to sit beside her and hold her hand, and that's when I saw the opened bottle of pills by the purse. I was about 11 or 12 years old at the time, so I knew what was going on. I instantly started screaming and throwing myself against the floor. She tried to convince me that she hadn't taken them yet. I was young, but I wasn't stupid. I tried my best to keep her awake until the ambulance got there, while also keeping my parents updated. Spent the next couple of hours getting an ambulance ride and at the hospital and had to wait there until my mom showed up. I'm 24 now, and anytime someone mentions suicide, I always think back to this. Just thankful she survived because I'm an uncle and 2 adorable nieces and my nephew. The funeral of my best friend. He died in a car crash back in 2019. The other guy who was with him, another good friend of mine, has a severe brain damage and he has to live with it for the rest of his life. He isn't in his mind. It's called minimal state of consciousness. That means he can get hungry, he can sleep and wake up, he can feel when it's time to go to the bathroom, but he can do nothing by himself. He requires 24/7 medical assistance. The accident happened on a Friday night. I chose to remain at home that evening. If I had taken a different choice, I'd have been with them. Maybe if I had been with them, it wouldn't have happened. It's my biggest regret till this day. My dad used to go to a local butcher shop Wednesday nights to hang out with his friends. Usually didn't come home until late, but would always check up on my brother and I and turn off all the lights. Wake up in the morning, lights still on. Check his room, no one's home. Mild concern. Call a cell phone, no answer. Eat breakfast, get ready for school, and call a cell phone. No answer. Properly concerned. He's a very reliable guy. Call his cell phone and a voice that wasn't my father's answers. Tells me he had an accident, was at such and such hospital, and that we had to get there as soon as possible. He had gotten too drunk on moonshine and blacked out in the snow on his way out his friend's door. Pretty big guy, so they just put a blanket on him. Didn't try to move him. Absolutely horrible frostbite, all up his back and legs. Ended up needing some skin grafts, rehab, etc., but absolutely pulled through. All of the ensuing events were pretty shitty, but the feeling of making those phone calls messed me up. Still gives me a very helpless feeling to this day. Having your mind race through possibilities and worst-case scenarios, only to have one of them be directly confirmed is not something my 11-year-old brain was ready for. March of '88. I was in the army stationed in Germany. My friend was moving a generator off a 2.5 ton. He was pulling it backwards. As he got close to the edge, he tripped and fell off, so did the generator. It crushed his head from the eyes up. I could still hear the screams from my other army buddies and the medics running. Then to hear the chopper take him to Frankfurt, where he was pronounced dead. Many years later, his fiancée contacted me and wanted to know what happened, as she thought the army version was rubbish. I told her all I saw, and she was dumbfounded that the army left so much of the official record out. Rest easy, Bruce. Miss you, buddy. When I was 20 years old, I was walking laps at a small-town high school track I just moved to, town of 400 in South Dakota. I saw a bigger boy, about 10, trying to sodomize a much smaller boy, maybe 6, and making him SSD instead when he couldn't fit. I was so taken back that I just awkwardly laughed, but then I told him to get out of here the third time I lapped around and noticed it. Who am I today? Even just a few years ago would have been more hands-on, asking for their names, finding their homes, calling police, etc. But I was so shocked it haunts me to this day. It makes me sick I didn't do more but awkwardly laugh and tell them to get out of there. Watching my dad overdose, foaming out of the mouth on our couch. I was probably like 4 or 5, but remember it so vividly. Watched my mom trying to resuscitate him while my 3 siblings ran out to get help. I just remember her screaming, crying as she did CPR to not leave her yet. That she's not ready to lose him, and they still have 4 kids to raise together. They took him out on a stretcher, but put a white cloth over him, so my siblings and I thought he was dead. He was out of it, but singing him and seeing him in my mom's song Wonderful Tonight by Eric Clapton as they pulled the stretcher out. I remember he finally came home from the hospital and he was getting out of the shower. We walked into the house as he came out of the shower. I don't remember if I said something, but he dropped to his knees, hugging me, sobbing on the kitchen floor. He still had the sticky stuff from all the things they attached to him at the hospital. As adults now, he told us that he saw a white light and a man's voice speaking to him as if he was ready to go and cross over, but he knew he wasn't ready. He only ever drank as a young teen and never messed around with any kinds of drugs ever again, besides weed, which I don't consider a hard drug. He doesn't like to talk about that event much, but it shook him to his core and made him get his shit together. I remember being so young and not truly understanding the concept of death. My siblings and I stayed at my aunt's house, and I just remember asking them 3 if Daddy is dead. It was traumatizing to see my mom begging for him to come back to her. I still remember the pain and fear in her voice. I just stood at the end of the couch watching with no reaction. My parents aren't perfect, but they did everything to give us a roof and clothes over our head, especially my mom coming from a third world country to make a living here in the US. It reminds me how grateful I am for them despite their flaws. I hate thinking of that day. I'll eventually lose them. My dad committed suicide in 2011. The police wouldn't let me in the basement, and the minute they said, "Oh shit," I knew my dad was gone. Thankfully, I didn't see his dead body, but I escaped my room and seen him being taken out in a body bag. My godfather wouldn't let me in the basement as he didn't want me to see the blood, but I ended up going down there anyway. The blood on the floor and finding a bullet fragment was enough to make me black out.